WAF detection with WAF. What is a WAF? A WAF is a web application firewall. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to detect web application firewalls with a tool called WAFW. Really cool name. So, as I said, we're going to be utilizing Kali Linux. And in this case, I'm going to be using my own Kali Linux VM. Because again, we're doing this on, we're essentially going to be interacting with the website on the internet. So again, you can follow along, and we're going to be utilizing the same sites that we've been using so far. So I'm just going to switch over to my Kali Linux VM. You can see I'm currently on the WAFW GitHub repository. It'll give you a little bit of a description as to what it does. So you can see that WAFW is the web application firewall fingerprinting tool. How does it work? It essentially sends a normal HTTP request and analyzes the response. This will essentially identify a number of WAF solutions. Now, the really cool thing about this tool is I've used it in multiple penetration tests, and it's really, really cool or very useful in identifying or quickly identifying whether a website or web application is being protected by a web application firewall. And not just that, it just doesn't tell you that the site is being protected by a firewall or web application firewall. It tells you the actual web application firewall that's protecting the site, and you'll actually see this in action. So you can view the list of web application firewalls that can be detected by WAFW. So that can be done by typing in WAFW and L. Now, I believe WAFW comes pre-packaged with Kali Linux. Let's actually test that out. So I'm just going to open up a terminal and let's see if we have it. Yeah, there we are. Looks like we have it. So we can list out the list of firewalls that WAFW will detect. So you can see you pretty much have all the proxies, all the firewalls or web application firewalls like Cloudflare. We also have BlockDOS, Beluga, so on and so forth. We also have BitNinja, very, very popular. And yeah, this will just give you an idea as to what you're dealing with, right? So whenever you're performing passive reconnaissance on a website, you really want to know whether it's being protected by a web application firewall, because as you've seen with hackersploit.org, because it's going through Cloudflare, you firstly cannot identify the IP address of the actual web server that's hosting the website. So, identifying that a site is being protected by a web application firewall will help you better strategize what your next steps are. So what we're going to do now is, if we take a look at the instructions, it's very easy to use. We can just type in WAFW and then, hackersploit.org. And let's see the output it provides here. So it's going to start it up, and you can see we have the really cool dog icon or dog ASCII art here. So you can see it's going to check the site, and it tells us the site hackersploit.org is behind Cloudflare. Fantastic. So we could have run this before, but I wanted to actually highlight this particular tool in its own video. Well, let's try and see whether zonetransfer.me is being protected by any web application firewall, because that's something that we really couldn't tell from the whois lookup or the DNS lookup, or when we performed DNS reconnaissance in the previous video. So I'll type in WAFW, and the domain is zonetransfer.me. So I'll hit enter. And let's see what happens, or let's see whether this site is indeed being protected by some form of a web application firewall or proxy. All right, so you can see that WAFW tells us that this site is not being protected by a web application firewall. Fantastic. So that pretty much means that the IP address we identified with DNS dumpster in the previous video could possibly be the IP address of the server that's actually hosting that website. Now let's try this on hackertube.net, which I own. So I'm giving you the permission to do this. So hackertube.net. You should see that this one is behind a web application firewall. And in this case, it tells us it's behind Lightspeed, which is interesting because it's actually behind Securi. But there we are. It's fairly simple to use, fairly simple to understand. You can take a look at the usage instructions provided on the GitHub repository. As you can see, we don't really need to install it because it comes pre-packaged with Kali, and all you need to do is just specify the actual website itself. So the correct way of specifying it is by specifying the actual schema or protocol first, And let's see whether that changes the output of WAFWolf. Indeed, it doesn't. And of course, I'm going to assume it doesn't do, it'll not change the output for both the websites that we tested earlier. So that's pretty much how to use WAFWolf. You can take a look at the documentation. It's really well documented. You can test multiple targets. You can test for a single WAF instance, or you can test for all possible WAF instances. So let's try that right now. So you can see that if we wanted to test for all possible WAF instances, we can utilize the A argument. So let's try that against hackertube.net. So I'll just type in A there at the end of the argument or at the end of the command. So it still tells us, there we are, we actually get the information we were looking for. So it tells us that it's behind Lightspeed and or the Security Cloud Proxy, which is very, very interesting. So you can see that you actually need to tweak your checks. So let's try and do that for zonetransfer.me just to see if we missed anything. So I'm just going to let this complete. If it takes longer, then that means that there really isn't a proxy or web application firewall intercepting or filtering the traffic. So again, there we are. It looks like it is, there doesn't seem to be a WAF, but right over here, you can see when we performed all the checks, it tells us that the site seems to be behind a WAF. The only way to conclusively test this would be, within the active information gathering phase, where we can perform a port scan on the IP address of the actual, web server that we were able to identify. But there we are. That's how to use WAFWolf. And that is going to conclude the practical demonstration side of this video.